Hey guys, welcome back to another movie review, and today we will be reviewing the film Star Trek Beyond. Now, how does it stack up with its other two prequels? Let's find out. If any of y'all have been following me for a while, you've probably noticed that as far as all the reviews I've done on my channel, I have never once ever reviewed any of the Star Trek films. But what I can tell you is that I have seen at least the previous two before this that were directed by, or at least the first one that was directed by Abrams, and then the rest that were produced by Abrams. But I never saw any of the original five that had like Leonard Nimoy and William Shatner. I didn't ever watch any of those. So that being said, I must make a disclaimer is that I am not someone who particularly grew up watching Star Trek. I wasn't a huge Star Trek fan most of my life, and that alone is probably going to turn some people off from this video, but I hope that by reviewing this movie I can give more of like an outsider's perspective of watching a Star Trek film as someone who is not seemingly a Star Trek fan, as it were. So please bear with me as I go through this review. This particular franchise, and by franchise I'm talking about the Abrams films, these particular Star Trek films seem to do well as far as all the kind of reception they get upon release. They're all seem to get good reviews as far as like what people say on Rotten Tomatoes and what the individual reviewers say on like other platforms like YouTube or news articles or whatever. The press always speak well of these films, and you know, it's kind of something I take with a grain of salt, because I have many friends who are Trek fans, and there are some of them, and when I say Trek fans, they are like veteran Trek fans. They're the ones who followed the whole franchise from beginning to end from back in the 60s as it went through Deep Space Nine, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and then Voyager, and all that stuff. And they're big fans of the old Star Trek stuff, and a lot of them do not like Abrams' versions of Star Trek, and which I can kind of understand, as it takes a whole new spin on things. But if you're not quite familiar with the Star Trek series as it's concerned, these reboots, while they aren't technically reboots, they are still canonical, because if you ever watch the first film, and I'm not going to spoil anything, but there's something that happens in the first Star Trek film that connects it to the rest of the previous films. And that being said, it's kind of still a continuation, but on like a different, again, I'm spoiling too much and rambling a little bit, but needless to say, they are still connected. But it's still fresh and new, considering the new cast that this film franchise has. Speaking on the movie itself, this may be more applicable to people who have seen the previous two, but as far as it holds up to the other two films, I feel like it does hold up well as far as meeting it. But I'm not going to be the kind of person who's going to think like nothing compares to Into Darkness. And I think why Star Trek Into Darkness was so successful was because people were mainly operating on their nostalgia, where they're like, oh my gosh, Khan came back and it's going to be like old Star Trek again, and like, you know, all that stuff. And you know, particularly because I'm an outside observer, that kind of old nostalgia doesn't appeal to me, not as much as it would like a die-hard Star Trek fan. So I'm not trying to compare it to anything, especially this film. This film as a standalone will satisfy you, especially if you like the previous two films. It does continue the franchise in a very admirable way, but it also has a huge throwback to the old school Star Trek stuff. There's a lot of flashbacks, or not flashbacks, but there's a lot of call-outs concerning the old films, and I think that's particularly admirable, considering that all the stuff that's happened in the previous year, especially with the passing of Leonard Nimoy. Spock, the original Spock, does have a cameo in this film, sorta. I'm not going to get into that really, but needless to say, they do pay the new cast of this film do definitely pay their respects to the old cast in many different ways. The thing about Star Trek is many people who may not be huge fans of the series, they may look at Star Trek and see it as something that's somewhat getting monotonous or old, considering how old the franchise is. Yeah, we're getting along like half a century old here. They're like, how long can they keep this up? Well, you know, especially if you're not someone who watched the old Star Trek stuff, I think one big reason why people come back to these movies and why there's like a whole new generation of people who like these movies is not necessarily because of the plot. And even I'll admit, when it comes to these type of summer blockbusters, especially with Into Darkness, that it had a very convoluted plot in my opinion. It just did, and especially with summer blockbusters, something have come to a consensus to about summer blockbusters is that they are just really overwhelmed with the action sometimes. And again, I understand that's why people go to see movies, but here I am trying to judge it based off what actually makes a film good. You know what I'm saying? And the only reason I think why people come back to this particular branch of the franchise, these reboots, is because the characters are actually written real well. You know, you obviously have James T. Kirk and Spock, and then, you know, you have Scotty and Hikaru Sulu and all these people, and they're just written well as far as how they interact with each other, because you can definitely get a sense from the movie that they are a team of sorts and they're kind of in this together. The whole journey itself is as far as like kind of a brief synopsis, the journey, this particular adventure they go on is about halfway through their 5-year adventure. So I guess that would probably means we're going to have at least 2 more films. I'm kidding, by the way, but that remains to be seen. But needless to say, this is kind of like, again, your typical something happens as far as a major conflict that puts almost the entire cast, or I'm sorry, the entire crew of the Enterprise in peril, and they have to somehow get through it. And along the way, they do meet new people and make new friends. And that all isn't very well good as far as how the plot is structured, where it's quite even in a lot of places. It doesn't ever like take a moment to allow itself to peak too soon or too late. It paces itself really well. The plot, fortunately, is something I find was a little bit better to understand than the previous 2. I guess it's only because, especially if you at least understood what you're going into as far as what's happened in the backstory, a lot of the stuff that's going forward makes sense in a lot of ways. And it's something. It was not a film that I felt like I got lost in. You know, thank God. Especially amidst, again, all the blockbuster action chaos that's going on and the story they're trying to tell. I was grateful that I never got lost in it. To talk about like a couple of things that they've kind of tried to do, one remark that was kind of happening in the news lately concerning Star Trek was the fact that they were going to try and make Sulu gay. Now, I myself, you know, I'm kind of impartial to that whole thing. I'm like, okay, that's great. You know, we have like diversity and stuff going on in Star Trek. Like it didn't have it already. You know, if you are anyone who's even remotely watched anything from the old Star Treks, they were meant to kind of push the boundary as far as what society was considered, you know, progressive, you know, at the time. Star Trek has done stuff in a very subtle way that pushes those kind of boundaries. And even me, you know, you would probably think, you know, well, I'm gay, of course I would like it. Well, I felt like maybe this a little bit was too forced. Again, I'm not complaining. If they want to make Sulu gay, you know, fine. But even George Takei thought it wasn't a good idea as far as the character, how it was originally imagined by Gene Roddenberry. Again, which I can understand. If they had made another character be kind of like a gay representative, I guess you could say, that would have been fine. But it feels like they made Sulu gay simply because George Takei is gay in real life, and that's kind of how I felt. Again, I'm not complaining, but in the movie they really make this clear. Like, they hold no expense with really making it clear that Sulu is gay, and we're gonna let you know about it, and it's probably gonna be something you're gonna have to remember for the future. You know, you can consider it what it is. I'm definitely not complaining. You know, I think it's great. That's what they're doing. But I feel like you may come across that as a little bit forced, is all I'm trying to say. This is also coming on the cusp, of course, upon the death of Leonard Nimoy, and then, you know, quite recently the death of the actor Anton Yelchin. Thankfully, like, as far as how it affected the movie, it didn't affect it a lot. But I guess sometime after the press junket, when the accident happened with Anton, they had to make a small little change, I think, to the film. But it's something you'll catch in the credits, obviously. Not that I know that's a huge spoiler, but it's kind of nice that they kind of threw that out, especially even if they had to do something real quick before it got released in theaters, or at least even if the press saw it first and then we got to see it as just regular audience. They do obviously commend and shout out both Leonard Nimoy and Anton Yelchin. I thought that was a very graceful touch. Perhaps the last thing I can talk about in this review is maybe, while we do understand the motivations and everything about the characters themselves aboard the Enterprise, Bones, Kirk, Spock, Sulu, Scotty, all of them, we understand like how they are as characters, and as far as their individual relationships with each other, it's something that does keep getting explored and progresses with time, but it's something we're not used to. So the only thing that's left for us is probably to study the villain. Now, again, talking about what I said earlier, this villain, played by Idris Elba, may at first, for a lot of people, feel more underwhelming, especially when he's trying to compete against the likes of Khan, which is, the most iconic villain of arguably in all of Star Trek. He's having to compete against that. But you don't learn his complete motivation until you get to the third act, because otherwise he seems like a very cookie-cutter villain with no type of motivation attached to him. You don't learn it until the third act. But even then, in my opinion, it was something that they had to really dish out really quickly in order to make it more, I guess, to make him more of a sympathizable villain, in my opinion. It's something they really had to throw out really quickly at the end. And I guess if you're kind of paying attention, you might catch it. Otherwise, the villain may seem kind of overwhelming. But as far as what he has under his arsenal, it's without trying to spoil anything. Obviously, basically the beginning of this film is that obviously the USS Enterprise is out on a mission going out to this nebula, and it gets devastated by this massive army of ships, of like these almost semi-biological ships of sorts that completely tear the ship apart. And it's kind of like, like if anything, if this is as bad as it gets as far as what happens to the USS Enterprise and its crew, this is as bad as it gets, and you feel like the stakes are really high, especially once all that happens and it proceeds into the second act of the film, where basically it almost becomes like a survival movie. The crew is trying to get out of this disastrous situation, and it's kind of not I don't want to say like a fresh take, but it's an interesting take on how they decide to approach that, because now that we are used to these characters and we come to like these characters and respect these characters, now we have to get to the point where we're in a franchise where we have to put these characters in huge peril, to only keep it interesting. And as far as the choices they made as far as just filmmaking, I thought it was really good, in my opinion. So to wind up this video, I would say that's pretty much my review of Star Trek Beyond. Definitely on par with its previous two predecessor films as far as keep maintaining the standard of good blockbuster movies, and also as it compares to the previous Star Trek films. Basically, you won't be disappointed in this film, especially if you've seen the previous two, as far as being entertained and just basically liking the entire ride as you go forward, as far as experiencing the story and the whole new adventures that the Star Trek Enterprise crew has to face. So that being said, I guess if I have to give this any type of score, it's like I would give it like an 85 to 90 percentile. Definitely worth it, especially if you're fans of the previous two films, and it's something that you will definitely enjoy. Thank you all for watching, and please stay tuned for the next review when it comes up.